When a family shatters, we are conditioned to expect noise. We are trained by cinema and sensationalism to look for explosive climaxes. We expect shattered plates in the kitchen, screaming matches on the front lawn, the chaotic, violent unraveling of a holiday dinner. We expect betrayal to announce itself with a megaphone. We want the villain to sneer and the victim to weep, because that kind of noise makes trauma easy to categorize. But in the real world, the deepest, most permanent, and most violent fractures rarely make a sound. They do not happen in moments of fiery passion. They happen in quiet, sterile rooms, between people who share the exact same blood, but who no longer share the same reality. Welcome to Unmasking Family. Today, we are looking at a story of duty, delusion, and the devastating cost of pride. We are looking at the story of David and Elena. They are siblings. Right now, they are sitting in a stark, quiet lawyer's office in the center of the financial district. They are here to finalize their father's estate. The dust is dancing in the cold sunlight pouring through the horizontal blinds. To the outside world, to the receptionist who offered them weak coffee, to the paralegal making copies in the hall, to the lawyer drafting the final signatures, they are simply a tragedy of grief. They are just two adult children mourning a patriarch, navigating the mundane bureaucracy of death. But in this room, they are enemies. They have not spoken a single word to one another in 90 days. The silence between them is heavy, thick with an unspoken, paralyzing betrayal that has completely obliterated 30 years of shared history. They are not plotting revenge. They are not planning a lawsuit. They are simply sitting in the rubble of their family tree, acutely aware that the roots have been permanently severed. To understand how they got to this room, and why neither will ever look the other in the eye again, we have to go back to the beginning of the end. We have to examine the exact same 18-month period. But we have to look at it through two entirely different sets of eyes, and two entirely different psychologies. 18 months ago, David was living the exact life his father had always envisioned for him. He was in his early 40s. He was married, living in a pristine, aggressively manicured suburban home, and operating his own mid-sized commercial logistics company. In the complex, unspoken ecosystem of his family's dynamic, David was the golden child. But being the golden child is not just a privilege. It is an invisible, crushing weight. It comes with the expectation of unwavering, perpetual success. His father, Arthur, was a hard, stoic man of a different generation. To Arthur, success was not something to be celebrated. It was simply the baseline requirement for respect. Arthur did not believe in participation trophies, and he did not believe in second chances. When David was 12 years old, he broke his arm during a baseball game. Arthur didn't run to the field to comfort him. He waited in the car, and on the ride to the hospital, he lectured David on the poor footwork that led to the fall. David internalized this early. He learned that love was conditional on achievement. He learned that failure was a moral defect. He became the anchor of the family. He was the one you called when the car broke down, when a loan was needed, when a complex logistical problem had to be solved. He was the fixer. But David was harboring a secret that was slowly, methodically eating him alive from the inside out. His logistics company, the crown jewel of his public identity, the very thing that earned his father's elusive respect, was silently bleeding out. It wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow, agonizing asphyxiation, a combination of lost legacy contracts, terrible macroeconomic shifts in the supply chain, and a few disastrously aggressive investments had left him leveraged to the hilt. He had taken out massive predatory loans against the business to keep the payroll afloat, convinced that he could turn it around with one more big quarter. He lied to his board. He lied to his wife. He lied to himself, but that quarter never came. Bankruptcy wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was scheduled. It was a mathematical certainty, ticking down on his glowing laptop screen at 3 in the morning, while his wife slept soundly beside him. The margins had inverted. The creditors were calling his personal cell phone. He was a man standing on a trap door, just waiting for the latch to give way. And then, the phone rang. Before we talk about the diagnosis that shattered their world, we have to understand the only thing Arthur loved more than success. We have to talk about the cabin. In the late 1980s, when David was just a toddler and Elena was not yet born, Arthur bought 5 acres of untamed land in the mountains. He didn't hire contractors. Over the course of 5 grueling years, working every weekend and every holiday, Arthur built a sprawling, rustic wooden home with his own 2 hands. The cabin was not just a piece of real estate. It was the physical manifestation of the family's history. It was the geographic center of their universe. Every wooden beam in the ceiling had been hoisted by Arthur. Every nail in the wraparound porch had been driven in while David watched. It was the site of every childhood summer, every Christmas morning, every foundational memory David and his younger sister Elena possessed. It was where Elena learned to walk. It was where their mother, before she passed away a decade ago, spent her evenings sewing intricate, hand-stitched quilts by the fireplace. To the outside world, it was an asset valued at roughly $900,000. To the family, it was a museum of their existence. It was unencumbered, fully paid off, and completely sacred. If Arthur worshipped anything, he worshipped that cabin. It was his legacy. It was the undeniable proof that he had carved a space out of the world and provided for his bloodline. At the exact same time David's financial life was entering terminal failure, his father, Arthur, was diagnosed with a rapidly progressing terminal illness. The timeline of a family tragedy rarely respects convenience. The diagnosis was aggressive, unforgiving, and left Arthur with perhaps a year to live. The family was immediately thrust into the chaotic, terrifying world of palliative care, hospital beds, and legal preparations. Because he was the eldest son, and because he was the successful one, David held the durable power of attorney. He was the financial executor of the estate. And because of this, David knew a brutal, terrifying legal truth. If his personal finances collapsed into a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the courts and the creditors would begin a forensic audit of every single asset his name was attached to. They would look for collateral to liquidate, to satisfy the massive commercial debts. And because his name had been intertwined with his father's estate for tax structuring purposes years ago, a move designed to bypass probate, the creditors would inevitably set their sights on the family's most valuable, unencumbered asset. They would take the cabin. The bank wouldn't care about the hand-stitched quilts or the porch Arthur built. They would auction it off to the highest bidder to cover David's failed business loans. His father would die knowing his eldest son was a failure who lost the family legacy. David was desperate. In a final humiliating attempt to stave off ruin, he arranged a private dinner with a wealthy college friend, a venture capitalist. Over $1,000 bottle of wine, David swallowed his pride and begged for a bridge loan, a bailout, a private lifeline. His friend listened politely, looked at the financials David slid across the table, and shook his head. "It is a sinking ship, Dave," the friend had said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Let it drown. Protect your personal assets and file the paperwork." David walked out of that restaurant into the freezing rain and threw up in the alleyway. He was out of options. He found himself pacing in the freezing hospital parking lot later that night, staring at his phone, surrounded by the hum of ambulance engines. He looked at Elena's contact name on his screen a dozen times. His thumb hovered over the call button. He could have called her. He could have told her the truth about his failure. They could have immediately hired a specialized trust attorney. They could have found a way to untangle the assets, to put the cabin into an irrevocable trust, to shield it from his impending financial doom. But David's psychology wouldn't allow it. To admit failure was to destroy his identity. To look his dying father and his exhausted sister in the eye and admit he was bankrupt was a fate worse than death. Furthermore, he convinced himself that Elena was already drowning. She was taking on the day-to-day physical care of their father. Why burden her with a financial apocalypse she couldn't possibly fix? So, standing in the cold, David made the hardest, darkest decision of his life. He decided to play God with the family's legacy. He would orchestrate a private, unlisted, off-market sale of the cabin to an anonymous real estate holding company. He would take the cash, quietly pay off his ruinous business debt, and untangle his name from the estate entirely. He would save the family name from the public humiliation of bankruptcy. He convinced himself that the cabin was, at the end of the day, just wood and glass. In the deep, silent hours of the night, David viewed himself as a tragic martyr. He was a man willing to carry the terrible sin of theft, to bear the weight of isolation, all to protect the people he loved from the ugly truth of the world. But reality looks very different from the trenches. While David was busy playing the silent martyr in high-rise offices, his younger sister Elena was suffocating on the ground floor. If David's burden was financial and theoretical, Elena's was visceral, physical, and immediate. Elena was in her early 30s, single, and had spent the last decade aggressively building a flourishing career as a marketing director. She was on the verge of a massive promotion, a partnership track that would have secured her financial independence for life. But when Arthur got sick, Elena didn't hesitate. The unspoken rules of family dynamics often dictate that the unmarried daughter absorbs the weight of caregiving. She took an indefinite leave of absence from her career. She traded sleek boardrooms for bleak waiting rooms. She traded her hard-won independence for a life measured entirely in 4-hour medication intervals, oxygen tank refills, and the indignities of a failing body. Caregiving is a unique kind of eradication. It slowly deletes your personality until you are nothing more than an extension of the patient. Elena stopped sleeping through the night, terrified she would miss the sound of Arthur choking. She stopped seeing her friends. She stopped eating full meals. To Elena, David wasn't a protector. He was a ghost. He was the brother who conveniently always had a critical corporate meeting whenever their father needed to be lifted out of the bathtub. He was the brother whose phone went straight to voicemail when Elena was having a quiet, hyperventilating panic attack in the pharmacy aisle because the insurance claim for Arthur's pain medication had been abruptly denied, leaving her to front thousands of dollars on her own credit cards. Elena was outsourcing her entire life, her entire future, to keep their father comfortable. Meanwhile, David was outsourcing the agonizing, undignified realities of dying to his younger sister. She survived the crushing, day-to-day isolation of caregiving by clinging to one single, desperate thought. "We are in this together." She told herself that David was handling the complex financial architecture of the estate so that she could handle the care. She believed in the division of labor. She believed in her older brother. Even when he was absent, she believed his absence was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the family. He was managing the fortress while she manned the sick ward. But the breadcrumbs of David's secret began to surface, and with them came the most insidious form of betrayal, the gaslight. Elena was fastidious by nature. One afternoon, while sorting through her father's towering pile of mail at the kitchen table, she realized a gap in the paper trail. The biannual property tax notices for the mountain cabin, which usually arrived like clockwork, had stopped coming. A few weeks later, a letter arrived addressed to the estate from a title insurance company. Elena opened it. The legal jargon was dense, referencing a transfer of deed and a holding company she had never heard of. When she finally cornered David during one of his rare, fleeting 15-minute visits to the house, she presented him with the letter. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her hair tied in a messy knot. David didn't miss a beat. He didn't look her in the eye. He looked at his heavy, expensive watch. He took the letter from her hand, scanned it with manufactured annoyance, and crumpled it up. "It is a scam, Elle," he had said, his voice dripping with condescending reassurance. "These bottom-feeder title companies pull public records when someone goes into hospice and try to trick the family into paying fake transfer fees. I have already got my legal team handling it." Elena had hesitated. "But the property taxes, asset reallocation," David interrupted smoothly, using the corporate jargon as a shield. "I have sheltered the cabin into a blind trust to protect it from medical liens. The tax structure changed. Look, you have enough on your plate. Go rest. Let me handle the administrative headaches. That is my job." He patted her on the shoulder and walked out the front door, slipping into his luxury SUV. Elena was too exhausted to press the issue. The explanation sounded plausible enough to a woman operating on 3 hours of sleep. She went back to measuring out liquid morphine drops, trusting her brother, completely unaware that he had just looked her in the face and lied to her soul. October arrived. The leaves turned, the air grew sharp, and Arthur's condition deteriorated completely. He was moved to a permanent inpatient hospice facility. He slipped into a semi-comatose state, unaware of the world around him. Knowing the mountain cabin would sit empty for the harsh winter, Elena decided to drive the 3 hours up the winding roads, to winterize the pipes, cover the furniture, and pack away some of the more fragile family heirlooms. She specifically wanted to retrieve her late mother's hand-stitched quilts to bring to the hospice ward, hoping the smell of them might bring Arthur some subconscious comfort. It was meant to be a quiet, melancholic afternoon of reflection, a chance to breathe away from the smell of antiseptic and bleach. She pulled her old reliable sedan onto the long dirt driveway, the gravel crunching familiarly beneath her tires. But as she rounded the final bend through the ancient pines, she hit a wall of incomprehensible confusion. There was a strange, expensive, late-model SUV, parked exactly where her father's beat-up truck used to be. The front door of the cabin was propped wide open. A family she had never seen before, a husband, a wife, and 2 teenagers, were cheerfully carrying cardboard boxes and suitcases into the hallway. Elena stopped the car. Her brain simply refused to process the visual information. It was a glitch in the matrix, a physical impossibility. She stepped out into the biting mountain wind, her coat whipping around her knees. She walked numbly up the wooden steps, her heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. The new owner, a man in a crisp quarter-zip sweater, saw her approaching. He smiled warmly and waved a set of shiny new keys. "Oh, hi there," the man called out, stepping onto the porch Arthur had built. "Are you from the estate liquidator's office? We were told someone might come by to pick up the last of the staging furniture." In a single, violently disorienting instant, the world stopped turning. Elena didn't speak. She looked past the man, through the open front door. The erasure was absolute. The antique hall table where they used to drop their keys was gone, replaced by a sleek, modern, mirrored console. The faded floral rug in the living room had been ripped up, exposing the bare floorboards, and hanging above the fireplace, where her parents' wedding portrait had rested for 30 years, was a generic, mass-produced abstract painting. 18 months of Elena's utter devotion turned to ash in her mouth. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. David hadn't protected her. He hadn't been sheltering assets from medical liens. The letter wasn't a scam. He had stolen the only inheritance that mattered, right out from under her, while she was quite literally changing their father's adult diapers. He had liquidated their childhood, their core memories, and their shared history to save his own public pride. He had hired an estate liquidator to box up her mother's life and sell it to strangers. And he hadn't even had the courage to tell her. She didn't scream at the man in the sweater. She didn't cause a scene. She didn't fall to her knees and weep. She simply turned around, walked back to her car, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white, and drove 3 hours back down the mountain in complete, absolute, deafening silence. Which brings us back to the present day. The stark, quiet lawyer's office in the city. Arthur passed away 2 weeks ago. He died never knowing that the cabin he built had been sold to strangers. The funeral was a masterclass in public acting. David played the stoic, strong eldest son, accepting condolences with a firm handshake, a pillar of the community. Elena played the grieving, exhausted daughter, accepting casseroles from neighbors. But beneath the polished surface of her black dress, a deeply mature, serious, and terminal anger had taken root in Elena. It wasn't a fiery, explosive rage. It was an iceberg. Cold, massive, and entirely immovable. The lawyer finishes reading the standard, dry boilerplate of the will. He closes his thick leather folder, offers his practiced condolences one last time, and steps out of the room to file the paperwork with the clerk. David and Elena are left entirely alone. This is the silence we spoke of at the beginning. It is not peaceful. It is the vacuum left behind when there is absolutely nothing left to salvage. Elena slowly reaches into her purse. She doesn't pull out a tissue to wipe away tears. She doesn't pull out the estate paperwork to dispute a line item. She pulls out a single, rusted iron key, the original spare key to the cabin. She places it gently on the center of the glass table. The sharp, metallic clink echoes loudly in the cavernous boardroom. For 18 months, David convinced himself he was the brilliant architect of their survival. Elena knew he was just the architect of his own escape, and now, the absolute, undeniable evidence of his betrayal was sitting right between them. David turns away from the window. He looks down at the table and sees the key. The color completely drains from his face, leaving him looking as ill as the father they just buried. He opens his mouth. He is desperate to explain, to justify, to deliver the grand, heavily rehearsed, defensive speech he has practiced 100 times in the mirror. "Elena," David says, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with defensive panic. "The bankruptcy, the commercial creditors would have seized the house anyway. They would have taken it all. I had to. Who packed up Mom's quilt?" Elena's voice cuts through his excuse like a scalpel. Her tone is not angry. It is not hysterical. It is completely hollow, dead. David freezes. His defensive posture crumbles instantly. He doesn't have an answer. The staggering reality of what he has done, the intimate, sacred family history he handed over to sterile liquidators for pennies on the dollar, finally crashes down on him. He was prepared for a screaming match. He was prepared for accusations of grand theft. He was prepared to be called a liar. He had a robust, logical, mathematical defense for the money. He had no defense for the quilt. I don't know," David stammers, shrinking into his expensive suit. "The estate company, they boxed up the bedrooms. I wasn't there. I wasn't there." That was the summation of his entire role in the family. Elena doesn't cry. There are no theatrics. She just nods, once, a slow, agonizing confirmation of everything she already knew. She stands up and slowly buttons her winter coat. The atmosphere in the room is heavy, suffocating, and entirely serious. They do not yell. They do not throw things. They stand apart, separated by the length of the glass table, sad and in silence, as the absolute finality of the moment settles over them like dust. There is no reconciliation coming. There is no hugging it out. "You didn't just sell wood and glass, David," Elena says, her voice quiet, but carrying the unyielding weight of a judge rendering a life sentence. "You sold the only proof we were ever a family. Keep the rest of the money. I'm done." Elena turns and walks out the heavy oak door. She doesn't look back. David is left standing entirely alone in the boardroom, staring at the rusted key on the glass table. The silence of the room closes in on him, louder than any screaming match could ever be. The profound irony of family trauma is that the intent behind an action rarely matches the impact it leaves behind. David's intent was salvation. He truly, deeply believed he was absorbing a fatal blow so his family wouldn't have to suffer the indignity of ruin. He thought he was falling on a sword, but Elena's impact was utter betrayal. She was left with the sickening realization that her brother, the man she trusted to anchor the family, viewed their shared history as nothing more than a liquid asset to be pawned off for his own comfort and pride. In the concrete parking lot outside the lawyer's office, the final act of their family plays out. Elena walks to her old sedan. She gets in, starts the engine, and drives away, merging into the anonymous city traffic. She is poorer, she is grieving, but she is finally, completely free of the illusion. She will never answer a phone call from him again. A minute later, David walks out of the glass doors. He approaches his luxury SUV, the vehicle paid for by the ghost of his father's cabin. He unlocks it, sits behind the leather wheel, and leaves the engine off. His hands rest limply in his lap. He stares blankly at the concrete wall of the parking garage, looking thoroughly and utterly destroyed. He has his wealth, but he is completely alone. In the end, the corporate debt was paid. The family name remained unblemished in the public eye. Nobody at the country club knew how close David came to ruin. But as they drove away in opposite directions, destined to live the rest of their lives in the same city without ever speaking another word to one another, the truth was undeniable. The family name survived, but the family itself did not. Every home has a locked door. Behind the polished exterior of perfect holiday cards, manicured lawns, and successful careers, ordinary people make quiet, desperate decisions. Decisions about money, about pride, and about loyalty. These decisions rarely make the evening news, but they possess the power to alter the course of bloodlines forever. We look past the polished surface to examine what really happens when domestic bonds are pushed to the breaking point. No fluff, no sensationalism, just the raw truth of human dynamics. Because the scariest monsters aren't hiding under the bed, they are sitting across from us at the dinner table. What happens when your door opens? Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Unmasking Family and join us next time as we look behind the surface of another closed door.